Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Sunder Balakrishnan. Sunder is the Director of Supply Chain Analytics for LatentView Analytics, and his background includes roles focused on process and data, all with the end goal of solving some of the biggest challenges facing companies today. Sunder, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here and having this conversation. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I think where we're going to spend most of our time today is incredibly topical given the news headlines. But before we dig in, tell us a little bit more about your professional background.
Certainly. I'm passionate about everything to do with supply chain, procurement, manufacturing, that entire space. Also fascinated by the applications of data, analytics,
Yeah.
and good old logical thinking in this space to solve problems. I've been doing this for the last about 18 years, data-driven process improvements. Within the current role, I lead a group of what I like to call supply chain enthusiasts, about 20 supply chain enthusiasts who like to make and then break and then make it again and break it again and so on. So that's kind of what we do. We work in the data analytics space, and one of the pleasures of my job is I get to work across four industry verticals: consumer products, retail, technology as a vertical, as well as industrial automotive. So all the cross learnings from
Okay.
these domains is something I'm able to bring to our clients. So that's a bit about me.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is supply chain resilience. I think this is one of those things that everybody will agree is a good thing. We all want to be more resilient. At the same time, what exactly do we mean when we talk about resilience? Do you have a definition that you like to use, either to keep it straight in your own mind or to make sure that any group of people in a room, no matter who they are thinking in an aligned way when resilience is the focus?
Yeah. In the words of Rocky Balboa, it's not how hard you hit, but it's how soon can you get up when you get hit.
Yeah.
That in sort of a metaphorical manner is what resilience is. As a data guy, I like to define it a bit more mathematically if I
Sure.
can. So the way we typically look at it is any supply chain is an oscillating pendulum. You either have a situation of very little product available or
Yeah.
too much product available. Somewhere in that middle is kind of the green zone, the sweet spot where you want to operate. But anything and everything happening around in global events, even for that matter your own issues, will either swing you here or here. The definition of resilience is how far does any event swing you, and then how soon do you recover to come back
Yeah.
to what is called normal operations. The more you swing, the less resilient you are. The longer it takes for you to come back, the less resilient you are. That's kind of a simpler way to define it.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good way to look at it. And if we stay with this idea of a pendulum swing, when we
Mhm.
think of longer supply chains, what it actually brings to mind, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what it's called, so I'll just describe it. Do you know it's like a little desk toy and it's all the little silver balls, and you pull
Uh-huh.
the one back on the one end and it hits, and then they kind of go
Yeah,
back and forth?
yeah, yeah.
So when you think about product shortage or product excess or product quality issues, that's
Mhm.
happening at each little silver ball, but it's impacting the entire chain.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if we think about the idea of risk and also the need to build up resilience at each point,
Right.
where do you find in your work and your analysis that the majority of disruptions end
Mhm.
up taking place in this journey from some type of raw material to some type of finished product?
Fascinating question. First of all, what you described is what's called the bullwhip effect.
Yep.
So you one thing going wrong somewhere causes an impact for every next stage, and typically the way we look at it is any impact at a stage, if not caught and corrected, can have a 10x impact on the next stage, and then 10x more, and so on. So that, that being the philosophy, I've seen that over the last, say, 4 years, the part of the value chain that creates the biggest issues has been kind of moving and oscillating between different parts of the problem. So, somewhere in between, there was a consumer demand spike which caused the issue. Somewhere in between, there was a labor shortage which was causing issues. There was demand, there was supply, there wasn't enough labor to get work done. And then, of course, we've all seen, heard, and experienced enough of side shortages, right from chips being short to you know lithiums being short for batteries and whatnot.
Yep.
I think it is fascinating that in a value chain where so many things have to keep coming together so that consumer gets the end product, whether it's a car or a carton of milk, it's
Yes.
amazing. So many parts have to come together, which means that that supply chainer has to have this mental map of every part of it coming together, where is it coming from, and be ready for different types of disruptions.
Yeah.
The most latest, of course, being trade and tariffs that we can't do today without talking about that subject. But
I know. It's required. If you say supply chain, you also have to say tariff.
it is now natural, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's my view of sort of the value chain itself.
Yeah. And even going back to what you said earlier, I actually appreciate the fact that you're trying to look at this in a mathematical way. Because I think, if you just, I don't know, if you could take all of the energy out of it and just look at numbers on a page, it would still be incredibly complicated. But then when you layer on top of that, the absolutely understandable, but totally not helpful human emotion that goes along with all of this complexity, I think that makes it extra hard. I know I always advocate, if you're going to read general press news coverage of what's going on in a supply chain, give yourself time to step back and calm down after you do it, because we have to stay focused on the data. When we think about this idea of resilience, are there any data points that you use as regular frames of reference, either when you're talking about the cost of disruption, when you're talking about the frequency of disruption? Are there any sort of pieces of information that you go back to?
I want to say two that I kind of go back and refer to. One of them was, secondary research studies, kind of the back of the pandemic. So this was 2022, 23. Supply chains were slowly, starting to turn the ship in the right direction. It was very slow turn, but it was happening anyway. And as we were measuring, and we were trying to ourselves measure impact and try to understand how much has it bled our clients, we also referred to secondary research, and the kind of ballpark that we saw was every organization had roughly lost, about $20 billion sized organization had roughly lost $500 million in losses because of supply side disruptions.
Yeah.
Right from automotive companies not having critical parts to one fascinating example was a consumer product company that sold, skin cream, said that they had all the finished products waiting in the warehouse. But one of the sort of plastic spoons or spatula that have to go with the case
Yes.
was locked away somewhere in Italy. They were just not able to ship it out. And they were not able to realize for a month that the thing missing in the product was that spoon. And it just kept accumulating costs. So there are many such instances of cost and getting accumulated. So one part, of course, like I said, is the secondary research. But the other part that we've been doing consistently over the last 3 years is just corroborating this with data itself that we are analyzing directly with customers. But also, over the last 3 years, I must have spoken to about 200 different supply chain practitioners at different levels in different organizations. Like I said, I have the privilege of being able to do that across 4 industries. So learnings from that is also something we are accumulating to try and understand the real impact. It's fair to say about $500 million is something that a lot of people agree that a significant part of that research group that I just spoke about agree that's been the impact that they've had because of different disruptions.
Now, given all of those conversations that you're having, I know you have your four, excuse me, your four verticals that you focus in,
Yeah.
but do you tend to find that either based on competition, concentration, how they're structured, do some industries tend to be more or less disruption prone than others?
Again, interesting question. One hypothesis that we went with was, what's the depth of your supply network? And like you said, the balls that are there in your cascade,
Yeah.
how deep is your supply network and how many echelons do you have in your
Yeah.
distribution network as well? The more the number of nodes in the network, obviously the more complex, and therefore the likelier that a disruption hits somewhere and it cuts supply lines. So as an example, automotive companies, tech companies are known to have supply networks that can run 6, 7, 8 layers deep. So you have some little manufacturer in Indonesia who's supplying, say, a washer or some part that goes to some part of the eastern part of India.
Yeah.
Then it travels to Africa, then to Mexico, goes to Canada, and then comes to the US, because all along it's kind of accumulating more value in terms of other components coming together. Now, this is naturally a more complex network. The deeper you go in your supply network, the more disorganized the supplier is, and the more niche also that they
Yeah.
are.
True.
So that's one level of complexity. But we've also seen that with consumer product companies and retail companies, well, for retailers, the supply is typically from a consumer company. So while there is complexity in that as well, and we've seen retailers who import products getting smacked, but with retailers, they do have the option of being able to substitute one product with another to some extent and at least not get that badly impacted. Consumer companies tend to have 2, 3 layers of a network. It's not as complex as an industrial company. A lot of consumer, and I think that's the other nuance over there, is how locally sourced have you been
Right.
versus how globally sourced have you been, or do you need to be. I know food and beverages companies are typically a lot more locally sourced, so a lot more resilient. For them, weather becomes a kind of a disruption that disrupts their business. But yeah, there are so many layers to this based on industry, category, and so on. And
Yeah.
that's something we try to do with customers, is understand the context and the network before we jump into thinking, okay, what should be your resilience in the context of what kind of disruptions are you likely to face?
And if we connect all of this together, like I'm still thinking about Rocky Balboa, right? Attempting to get up off the floor of the ring.
Yeah, yeah.
If the idea of resilience is getting him back on his feet as quickly as possible, and you
Mm-hmm.
talk about those 6 to 8 tiers of the supply chain that you
Right.
might have to figure out where the disruption is, right? Find the little spoon for the cream. How do you start the conversation with companies about accelerating that discovery process? Whether that process is figuring out which tier of the supply chain the disruption is in or figuring out how to fix it, how
Mhm.
does speeding that up tend to work?
Mhm. I think one part of it is, it's not that organizations don't know or realize this. Procurement and supplier relation functions do realize it, but one grid that we put in front of customers as almost a starting point is to almost draw out a network structure and say, this is you, these are your tier one suppliers. By the way, this is your visibility arc. One of my team members has prepared this and done it quite well. She says, this is the visibility arc. All the rest of the network is a gray circle that you don't know who it is. And then we put a table, a 2 by 2, very simple one, where we say that 55% of all your disruptions happen in your tier one. You know who your tier one is, but you don't know the nature of risk and the impact of it. The remaining 45% happens in your tier two and beyond. You don't know the suppliers are, and you
Yeah.
don't know the nature of risk either. So this is the grid you need to solve for. And that kind of comes to hit you hard that, you know what, that's true. Now let me figure out how to get it started. What we also couple it with is, because we have access to certain data points, through some partnerships that we do usually take some sort of a sample of, here is your network for one of your products. right? Out of 1,000 products that you might be
Sure.
sold, what does that look like, and does it contextually make sense? Would, if this were available to you, would you actually be able to solve problems? And that gets people thinking as well and brainstorming. That's usually the starting point of it.
Yeah. Well, and it is sort of a good news, bad news situation, right? The bad
Right.
news is 55% of your issues are happening in the part of the supply chain you actually know about. So even though
No.
you have this information, you're not preventing these disruptions from taking place.
Yeah.
The good news is you know what more than half of your supply network is made up of, right? So
Yeah.
even though that 45% is still a huge number, are companies surprised? Like, are they usually surprised to be faced with this and to have it shown to them to say, you know about a little more than half? How surprised or, yep, nope, we knew we didn't have any idea. How do people tend to respond to that sort of information?
I think just one more layer on
Yeah,
that is what organizations also realize is, while I know 55% of my issues happen in my tier one supplier, a big chunk of that is because in a deeper tier suppliers something
true.
went on.
Yeah,
And maybe an issue happened 2 months ago. The tier one supplier themselves realized it only a week back when they didn't get their supplies. And then you get the bad news that, hey, I won't be able to honor my commitment to you because I got hit with this and I didn't even know it. So, in some ways, they both are on the same boat that they're now
yeah.
like, damn, where do I go next? Right. So, it's already too late because you could have known this 2 months ago when the original disruption hit the fourth or the fifth ball that you spoke about. So, what we tend to do is also in the discovery process have a conversation about, in the last year, what are those things that have actually come to punch you in the face?
Yeah.
What were the nature of those disruptions? Classify them into, was it your own inefficiency that caused it, which is in your control?
Yeah.
Go and solve it, right? Or you probably already are solving it. Which of this can be classified as things that you didn't realize because you had no visibility? And that's the part where then we could work together to figure out how to create that. For different organizations, I would imagine the percentage of that root cause might be different.
Sure.
For some of them, all 55% is down to that tier one supplier. For some of them, even within that 55%, 30% of it is because some tier two, tier three, tier four actually caused the havoc. Right. So,
And so at that point, it almost becomes a discipline. And this is so hard. I mean, it sounds like a simple thing, but you and I both know how incredibly hard this is to stop with the day to day and look back over the last year and
yeah.
say, what were our problems over the last year? Maybe the first thing you realize is you're not centrally tracking the problems. I mean, I
Yeah.
know for me, if I don't write it down, I don't know what I had for lunch yesterday, right? So if you want me to think back to what did you have for dinner last October, I have absolutely no idea. It could have
Good.
been the worst day of the whole month. I'm going to have no memory, right, of any of the details around that disruption. But prioritizing that, you can't approach the point of increased resilience if you're not having the discipline to stop and record and reflect and look back. And so, not easy, but at least an achievable practice that people can start with.
Yeah. And with a lot of organizations as they've evolved, they've generally put in place decent data management practices. So enough of this history is being recorded, has been recorded
Yeah,
in whatever way, shape, and form. It might be an Excel sheet, it might be some complex system, but somewhere you have been able to capture all these transactions and the events associated with these transactions.
yeah,
That's where then, if we totally understand that there are operations functions like procurement, supply chain, in inbound, you can't really sit back and reflect. You find it hard to do that, but
yeah,
that's where, working with a data analytics team that can actually say, you know what, hold on, I'll do that part. I have ways and means to do it faster, do it more better. And it's not just about speed and efficiency, it's also about I can uncover things that you may miss just because you may not have the tools or
yeah.
the right hypothesis for it. I'll be able to surface those insights out to you. And oh, hey, by the way, because I have access to that data history, a lot of history can tell me what might happen, and I can tell you
True.
how probable it is. So I'll make your life easier. That's kind of the way I would suggest procurement teams should collaborate with their data analytics teams
Yeah.
in order to maximize and squeeze out as much as they can out of the data that they're collecting.
Well, Sunder, this has been an incredibly interesting and definitely timely conversation. As we start to wind down our time, I want to bring you in on a tradition we have here at the Sourcing Hero. So I'm going to give you two questions. You can pick either one, and there are
Okay.
no wrong answers. So
Okay.
your choices are, what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or what do you think heroism looks like in a business context?
I'll go with the second one. What does heroism mean in a business context? Generally, when I think of heroes, when I think of people who are going above and beyond the normal to almost put in performances that absolutely blow your mind. I also think of people who have been down to earth, heads down, gotten down to their work. You almost don't realize they're there,
Yeah.
but it's when they're not there that you realize, oh, damn, I'm missing this person. And I'm also a sports fanatic. I play soccer, football. And there are times in football that there's some players on the pitch, you don't realize what they do, the kind of work they're doing for the team, and they're doing
Yeah.
it for the team till they're not there. And that's where,
Mhm.
like, wow, I'm missing that contribution. In many ways, supply chain sourcing is the underbelly of an organization. It's not the glamorous part of most organizations, it's the part that requires you to be heads down disciplined at it every day so that the consumer gets the product that they want. To me, every one of them on the field, and I recently had a chance to meet a couple of these managers at a warehouse in Chile. The discipline with which they were running operations, it's easy to kind of miss it if you don't pay that little bit of attention. But it's the day they put their hand up and say, you know what, I'm not going to do anything. Is the day you'll be like, oh man, you know what? Now I know what a real hero means.
Yeah.
And come COVID, come war, come whatever, these are the guys who are always there on the floor, making sure things happen. That to me is what heroism means. And I really appreciate it. Also, a shout out and a call out to every one of those supply chain folks on the ground in the back office trying to make sure businesses run, whether in healthcare, in consumer, whichever business. Truly appreciate and hats off to those guys.
I 100% agree. And you may not necessarily know who they are on an individual level, but you know that those people are present in an operation based on, I always think about gears, right? How smoothly do those gears run? Maybe
Yeah.
not glamorous to be a gear, but if you have an entire system running like that, it changes everything about how that company operates from the top to the bottom. Sunder, I've so appreciated this time with you. If we have people in our audience that are actually meeting you for the very first time through this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast, what would be the best way for them to reach out and connect with you or learn more about what you do?
I think the easiest, best way is you can find me on LinkedIn. Write me a note. Balakrishnan, you see the name on this profile, it's the same name. You can also type LatentView if that makes it easier for you to find me. Always happy to hear from like-minded folks who are trying to solve good problems in the market. Do write me a note when you send me, a connection. I'll appreciate that. And yeah, always happy to have good conversations with people who are trying to solve good problems. So thanks, Kelly. Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well and always remember that you can be a hero too.